I just can't help seeing at this stage. And by the way, we have a great advantage over them, a great, great advantage, which is that the people who push this stuff are pushing something false. How can you tell it's false? In the way that George Orwell told us to best identify false ideas, which is if the language is false. The language of these critical race theorists, like the post-everything feminists and the queer studies bullshit, all these people write atrociously because they think atrociously. They reveal themselves.
You ever tried to read Judith Butler?
Of course. Of course I've tried. I may not be the smartest person in the world, but I can usually get my head around ideas. And I read a couple of paragraphs of Judith Butler, and I have a migraine. I need to lie down for a short time because she's lying. And she's using language to try to cover over that fact. And the critical race theorists write impenetrable books and refer to each other's impenetrable books because nobody would read them ordinarily. Why would I read a critical race theory book when I could be reading Rilke?
No, it's really true. I think we both spent probably more time than any sane person should reading what are considered some of the great works of critical race theory.
Yes. By the way, I should say I have a tip for that. I think it's like drinking alcohol. You should drink a glass of water for every glass of scotch, just to keep the system well. For every bullshit book you read a good one. Mm-hmm. You know, at least those should be the odds.
Yeah.
And sometimes I find people are sort of they get that wrong.
Yeah.
You know.
No, and I think it's true. You know, unclear writing is usually a sign of unclear thinking.
Yeah.
And insofar as your thoughts are very clear, writing becomes much easier. This is, as an aside, I think one of the ways in which writing is mistaught. You know, I think you just give students a topic to write about that they may or may not care about or be thinking clearly about and say write well.
Yes.
Whereas we should, start with the thinking and go towards the writing.
And by the way, I mean, the other thing is I've been a writer all my life. I was always under the impression that the job of writing in ideas was to try to make complex things able to be understood. Yeah. And the great moments as you know, as a reader, the great moments are when a writer does that for you, and you have that feeling, what Aristotle called anagnorisis, the moment of recognition that you have found truth. And that moment comes when a great writer says something that you know to be true, and they have managed to distill the thought in such a way that you recognize it. Morally, you recognize it, and intellectually, you recognize it, and you're thrilled that somebody has done this for you.
No, the line of your book that stayed with me and gave me that unpronounceable word, that feeling, was about slaying dragons.
Yes.
Right. And I don't know if you want to talk about that, but
yes, no, I mean, it's actually partly lifted from the great Australian philosopher Ken Minogue, who wrote on a book called The Liberal Imagination in the 1970s, described a problem of liberalism. By the way, there's always, one has to caveat that the liberalism is a word that travels on a range of passports. But in The Liberal Imagination, he says one of the problems of liberalism is that once it's slain the dragon, it might find itself like St. George in retirement. The amount of esteem and prestige has been awarded to the dragon slayer might encourage the dragon slayer to stagger around the land looking for other beasts to slay in order to gain all of that admiration again, or in larger quantities even, multiple dragon slayings. And I extend this to say that I think this is the situation in modern liberalism, is that everyone wants to have been with Martin Luther King and the March on Washington. They want to have been with the suffragettes. They want to have been at the Stonewall Inn in 1968, but they missed it. Mm-hmm. So what do? And they stagger around the land, swishing their sword at ever smaller and less intimidating creatures, until eventually, and some people say we're not there yet, some people say we are, but eventually St. George is found swinging his sword at thin air. And I do think, I'm not being blasé about this, I do think to a great extent that's where we are. But just to return to this idea, the problem is, as I say, is that was the purpose of writing as I saw it always. And the purpose as a reader of reading was to be able to get the idea distilled for you by a mind capable of the distillation process. And what we have in the people that one is railing against at the moment are people who have done exactly the opposite. They actually have very, very simple ideas about people, about societies, about structures, much more. And they wrap it in this incredibly complex and convoluted language because there isn't much there. The whole thing is really quite easy to understand. Yeah. And they make it more complex. By the way, I should mention that you did one, which I'm always allergic to. You use meta-narrative. I was once at something with actually Ken Minogue, I just mentioned, and a young friend, an intellectual, and they used the term meta-narrative repeatedly. I never forget that Ken, who had sort of owl-like eyebrows, at one point sort of leapt forward at the end and said, "You keep saying meta-narrative. Why not just narrative?" And it is the case we've all had this lexicon of quite often just slightly more convoluted than they need to be terms. And we've all adopted it to some extent. I do meta-narrative as well occasionally, by the way. I'm not we can all do it. But, we have actually been adopting an unnecessarily complex language, even when we're criticizing it. There isn't that much in Butler. It's quite a straightforward, it's a set of assertions.
You know what? When the point you're making struck me hardest recently was reading Ibram Kendi's book, How to Be an Anti-Racist.
Very good example.
So Kendi, unlike the critical race academics, writes very simply. He writes simple, short sentences and so on. And then there gets to be a point in the book where he mentions systemic or structural racism as an aside. And keep in mind, this is a book whose purpose is to explain anti-racism
to the widest possible
readership. And what he says is, I'm not going to use the term systemic or structural racism in this book. I'm just going to call it racism because I found that I can't explain what systemic racism means to normal people. I'm paraphrasing, but that's essentially what he says.
Yeah, I remember that.
And I thought that's very interesting because this is a person whose job and essentially his job description is to be the best guy at explaining why systemic racism, this sort of what was once just an academic concept, is important, an important lens through which to revise your notion of what you thought racism was, right? We thought it was this individual thing, but what we're being told now is systemic. A system can be racist without any individuals.
Yeah,
and it's allegedly this complicated thing you have to understand, but why can't he explain it to us?
Yes, it's such a good example. It's such an intellectual fraud, isn't it, to do that? It's, as you know, I say this in Matters of Crowds, that there are these tricks that are being done on us all. One is, I would say, this one of, you must understand me, you will never understand. Another one is, this is glaringly obvious, and it's so complicated I can't explain it. I mean, that's a heck of a trick.
And if you ask me to explain it, it's emotional labor. Right. I shouldn't be asked to explain
it. I'll find it tiring.
Because people of color have been asked for too long to explain ourselves. It's exhausting.
It's exhausting.
But it's also the most important crusade in the world.
Yes.
But somehow my exhaustion means I should be exempt of it.
Yeah.